Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Crisis and Hope, YU Voices, which seeks to use the past to think about our present. YU Voices today is brought to you by the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs at Yeshiva and the YU Center for Israel Studies and Madai HaYahadut, Judaic Studies at YU. My name is Jess Olson. I'm professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University. And my guest today is Jon Madof. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment. Today's program, From Africa 70 to Zion 80, Race and Culture in Jewish Art. We will be discussing the relationship between art, the creative process, and our current cultural climate. For those of you with questions, we're going to have time. We're going to leave time at the end of the program for your questions, and we're asking you to just post them as comments into the comment into the chat window. So you should be able to do that, and I'll be taking from them at the end of the program. Okay, so here we go. Actually, just one thing more. I'm going to actually mute all of our participants just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and I'm going to, of course, unmute our guest. Okay. Jon Madof is a New York-based guitarist, for those of you who don't know him, I should say, a New York-based guitarist, composer, and producer. He's the band leader of the 10-piece Jewish Afrobeat jazz band Zion 80 and the trio Rashanim, both of which have recorded extensively for John Zorn Tzaddik Records label. 2017, Jon co-founded Chant Records with bass player and producer Shanir Ezra Blumenkrantz. Dedicated to adventurous music across the spectrum, Chant Records has released over 50 albums by an international community of artists. So, Jon, it's great to see you.
Likewise.
Thanks for coming in. Thanks for taking the time to do this with us.
My pleasure.
Be a really, really great conversation today.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's start with the basics, right? You describe your band. You describe Zion 80. We're going to focus on Zion 80, although I do love Rashanim as well. But you describe Zion 80 as Jewish Afrobeat. So what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is just tell us a little bit about the band itself. Kind of what its history, its configuration, and then if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of for those who aren't familiar with at least the genre of Afrobeat, or with what particular form of Jewish music you're engaged with in bringing the synthesis together. That would be great.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Sound great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess I'll start with just kind of a description of the music that we play, and then I can go a little bit through the history. So the music essentially starts from the core of it is a combination of Jewish music, specifically the songs of Shlomo Carlebach, and the music of Fela Kuti. So Fela Kuti was a musician who invented a genre that has come to be known as Afrobeat. I'm actually not sure if he gave it that name. He probably did, but he's kind of like the originator of it. So if you're thinking of any genre, I'm sure in other arts there are corollaries, but people debate for hours and hours who invented jazz, who invented rock and roll, who invented Baroque, whatever, which is more your world, which I would defer to you on that. But it's pretty much like Fela created Afrobeat. It's not really in dispute. It's like his style of music. So it's a single individual.
What character? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what characterizes Fela's style? I mean, what characterizes the sound of his band?
Yeah. Fela just time-wise lived from the 30s to the 90s, which I think is more or less, maybe Carlebach was maybe 20. I don't know exactly, but it's more or less they lived during the same time. Mm-hmm. Passed away within a year of each other, I think, in the 90s. So Fela was from the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria. Now, my expertise on like context and history and even culture and African politics and and American politics and all the things that inform that. Like I'm you know, primarily, as far as our discussion today, but just as a person in terms of what I do, I'm a musician. Like I respond to music, I play music. So my desire has never been to learn about the history and context for its own sake. So I could probably use to learn a little more about that. So, but there are like major gaps, and sometimes it's, but like musicians get into these discussions all the time. You know, I remember, actually, I'll just tell you an anecdote. A friend of mine, as I was forming Zion 80 and bringing in and out different musicians, my friend Eyal Maoz, who's a tremendous guitar player, he was, you know, he's not in the band now, but he was there for a bunch of gigs. And after like the third gig, I was like, da da da. And, you know, well, Fela would approach it like this, but I did this. And he was like, who? And I said, Fela. Am I pronouncing it wrong? And he was like, I don't know who you're talking about. I said, you just played 3 gigs with us and you killed it. You played everything I told you to play. You came to the rehearsal. You were he didn't know who Fela was. So, but to him, it's like, it's just sound, it's music. The drums do this, the guitar does this. When John points to me, I start. When he goes like this, I stop. And it's like, you know. So anyway, so Fela's music was characterized really by a marriage of his Yoruba tradition in Africa and in Nigeria rather, and that's like the part that I can't speak enough. I couldn't off the cuff tell you what the basic structure of your traditional Yoruba music is. However, he was coming from that place, and then he came to America, I think specifically Los Angeles in the 60s, and was, I'm sure had been influenced by American music before that because he played the tenor saxophone and the keyboard, but he was like crazy amount influenced by James Brown in the 60s and what James Brown was doing in the 60s and inventing, you know, that. So his music is really a marriage of like American Western, you know, funk music and traditional African music. The instrumentation is primarily Western, meaning guitars, a drum set, electric keyboards. It was like, you know, a funk band in the 70s. It would not have been out of place there. But there's call and response vocals, which is probably more reminiscent of his tradition. And there's also like percussion and the percussion elements, like they use the shekere, which is like a gourd that has beads around it tied with strings. And that's used a lot in West African music. I don't know the origin of it, but it's used a lot in West African music and not so much in funk music, maybe peripherally. So, and to me, when I heard his music, it was just immediately like infectious. Yeah. I love the sound quality of music recorded from like the late 60s to the late 70s. When recording was like good, but not too good. You know, when you would get that, like, can you believe it? Like this was recorded with one mic in a room and the drums sound amazing. And it wasn't like some science. It was like they were going by the feel of it. It sounded great. The other characteristic, which is Fela's music, is Afrobeat is often described as having, quote, an endless groove, which is his songs can be 30, 40, 50 minutes long, which often in the time meant that one side of an album had one song and the other had another song. So 2 songs on an album, or it was one song for the whole album, part 1 and part 2. Right. You know, which in the digital age is we're not so used to those limitations. So that's that. So he wrote all the music. The other major component in his music, which not to like music geek out on people too much, is his drummer, Tony Allen, who unfortunately just passed away not that long ago. And Fela's quote about Tony Allen is Afrobeat. So if you think about it, Fela invented the genre. He hired Tony Allen, but then if you listen to the sound of Tony Allen's drums, if you were just able to zero in on that as like comparing him to another jazz, like let's say a jazz drummer who was active at the time, or like a funk drummer like Clyde Stubblefield or like Tony Williams or something like that. Like you immediately hear the characteristics of the drums as informing the whole music. And then the only other thing I'll just reiterate.
It's the beat in Afrobeat.
It's the beat in Afrobeat, 100%. And particularly the snare drum, but that's going to like go a little too if you listen to the snare drum part.
Hey, I love getting into the weeds, but
yeah, that's too much. I'll go out. But also, and we'll talk about this, but the instrumentation of Fela, Tony Allen, I think was Nigerian as well. He may have been based in, I feel like every video that I saw of him after the 80s, he was in Paris. He may have lived there, but he was, as far as I know, Nigerian as well. I think they met in Lagos. They certainly worked together a lot in and around Lagos. The instrumentation of an Afrobeat band nowadays is kind of striking because it's huge. It's many horns, drums, can be 10, 20 people. It's like a big band. And my band, Zion 80, has 10 people in it. So that's like, I took my instrumentation directly from Fela. So
how about the Karlbach side? So that's of course the particularly Jewish spice that you add to this.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, for me, I mean, so I'm sure there are people on this call right now that could give a much deeper background of Karlbach's music. But to me, it was like when I didn't grow up observant, Baal Tshuva, but when I heard Karlbach, it was like the 60s music that my parents listened to, but Jewish. And to me, the thing that I relate to the most is like the melodies of Karlbach songs are so catchy and so like magnetic to listen to and to stick in your head. And it doesn't like hit you over the head with this like foreign, like klezmer, what to me sounded foreign, like klezmer, almost like cantorial, like inflections in the music. Like Karlbach doesn't really have that so much. It's more like something you can relate to, but it also has a very strong Jewish flavor. But really it's the melodies. And basically in a word, what I did was that the origin of the band was that I put Karlbach's melodies on top of Afrobeat's rhythm and harmonies. And since if you listen to a song, the melody is the thing that catches your ear the most. And then there's the accompaniment, but those two things did not interfere with each other at all. The rhythm of Karlbach's melodies is very malleable. You can do different things with it. And in Afrobeat has lots of great, tremendous amount of wonderful elements. Fela's melodies are great, but if you ask, what's your favorite, anybody, I would think, what's your favorite thing about Fela's music? The melody is not going to be the first thing that people say.
So it's So it's even adding structural, right? So it's yes. Even more innovative, right? Because you're really building off of, including another level to the structural foundation of the Afrobeat sound. Sounds like what you're doing.
Yeah, and that whole structure thing, because the other aspect to what we've done, we kind of have three repertoires that we do in the band. It's the Karlbach repertoire, which we started with. I have several original songs that we did on our last album. And then the other part is we have 2 albums of John Zorn's music, my arrangements of Zorn's compositions. So that gets more heavily into the structural stuff because that's where Zorn is coming from. But it definitely built on the structure of Afrobeat and added the Karlbach thing to that.
So it's very interesting. So I think this is a great segue to give people a little bit of a sample of what we're talking about. So I'm going to actually put on, for everybody's enjoyment, a clip of a performance of Zion 80 at Drome, which is a East Village club. I think it's from March 2019. Is that correct?
I think it was like a pre-Purim show. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, right around March. So I'm going to give me 2 seconds. I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to hear a little bit of Jon Madof and Zion 80. All right, bringing it home with Zion 80 playing Ain Kelokenu.
That was the short version.
Really gives a good sense, right? Really gives a good sense of what you're talking about, I think. I mean, I got to tell you, I hear that band, and it's just, there's so much, it's so tight, it's so smooth, but there's this raw, kind of authentic expressiveness going on there.
Thank you.
I hear Frank London playing. It sounded like, I'm hearing a little like 1970s Miles Davis going on, right? I mean, there was some really, really nice. Yeah. And klezmer, right,
yeah,
right.
Because he's like he's a founding member of the Klezmatics, which was like a big,
Right.
But the funny thing about
bands.
Yes. So I wanted to send that because it's like a clean, like beginning to end. It's a good, video version of the song. But I noticed as I was watching it that our two baritone saxophone players were not there at that gig. So the horn section was only 2 and not 4. And the drummer there, our drummer had another gig and he was late. So the drummer in that video is my percussion player, Marlon, who had to jump on the drums at the last minute. So it's not only the band, but like what happens, especially in New York when everybody, not now, but when live music is happening, when everybody's running to 10 different things and like, the drummer's not here. So, what do you do? But yeah, that's the band.
Right. Would you care to could you name the personnel, just to give a shout out to who was on that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm playing guitar, obviously. The other guitar player is Yoshi Fruchter, who's involved in a lot of Jewish and other music in New York and elsewhere. The drummer's Marlon Sobel, who usually plays percussion. The bass player is Shanir Blumenkrantz, who you mentioned earlier as my, co-founder of Chant Records. The keyboard player is Brian Marcella, who's a tremendous piano player also, and a composer and producer in his own right. And then Frank London is playing trumpet and Greg Wall is playing tenor saxophone.
Very nice, very nice. So now I want to go a little deeper for a minute, because one of the really fascinating things about your band and about the approach that you took, right, is this kind of cultural fusion. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly you're a jazz man, right? So cultural fusion is it's as old as the history of the genre itself. I mean, really goes back and it's an American genre, right? So in many ways, this is American history as much as it is, musical history, right?
For sure.
And jazz has always kind of been, on the cutting edge of these, in uncomfortable ways and sometimes comfortable ways, sometimes beautiful ways, sometimes conflictual ways, right? I've noticed, I was kind of thinking about it. It's like, if you go all the way back, to say like the 1920s, right? You always have this kind of back and forth between African-American musicians, white musicians. I'm thinking like, go all the way, Louis Armstrong and Big Spider-Big, right? You go, that's like during the Jim Crow era, right? You go to like the 30s and 40s, right? The beginning kind of the awakening of moving towards civil rights. You have Ellington versus, it's not really versus, but it is kind of versus, Benny Goodman and the big band era. You get into the 50s, into the civil rights era, and you've got Miles and Coltrane and all the, all the great bop and hard bop and post bop and all these people, right, up against, it's like East Coast, West Coast before Tupac and Biggie, right? It's
that's right.
You have Gary Mulligan, Chet Baker, right? And there's conflict there. I'm thinking like you're a Philly guy. I happen to know that about you. Shout out to Philly. I know there's a couple of Philly people here. I'm thinking of like, Questlove playing on The Tonight Show, having to like sort of deal with the fact that Jimmy Fallon, has to apologize for wearing blackface, right? I mean, there's always this kind of intermixture. And I'm just wondering, how do you see your music kind of at this moment in American history as part of that conversation?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there are so many angles into that. And I'll just tell you that as a musician, and as I've gotten older, I'm in my 40s. I'm 46, not like I wouldn't tell you which 40 I am. I feel like I've gotten more comfortable with where I'm coming from as an artist and a musician, less hung up on things that I can't do as well, more embracing of things that I do naturally. And what I've always done since I was a teenager is respond to music that I hear, and then I have the motivation to make music that is taking different parts of what I love and putting them into something that I respond to and resonate with. So whether that was like, you know, when I was 18 years old and obsessed with Fugazi and what would later be called like indie rock, but then was like on some kind of fringe of punk rock, and not even connecting that what I loved about Fugazi was that like they took the fairly basic structure of normal punk music, which is kind of a folk music, and then they injected this like funk thing, and it was just more interesting and layered and complex and nuanced. Not to mention what they stood for as far as this like embrace of youth culture. They wouldn't ever play a concert if it was 21 and over. So as a high school student, that was like, now if my kid said that, I'd be like, so wait till you're 21, who cares? But when I was 17, you could go see them. And not only that, but they would come out after the show off the stage and talk to you, which was like tremendous thing to connect with them. My love of jazz and all the other music that I love, and Fela's music and Shlomo's music, is just hearing something and responding to it and then making something out of it, collaging different things and bring my own thing. So to me, taking music that's African in origin or African American in origin is not any different than taking something that's Jewish in origin or European in origin or Japanese in origin. And that's just been on my mind lately because Shanir has been kind of stuck in Japan since coronavirus started. Like he could technically come home, but his wife lives there, and it's like, so we're talking a lot about like what it's like there. She lives on Sado Island, or they live on Sado Island now, which is an island off the northwest coast of Japan. And you know, he has a project with his wife that's intermingling like jazz and psych rock with the particular Japanese folk music from that island. It's amazing. So that's like what I've always done. And I realize there's a larger conversation about it, but it's always been kind of peripheral to me. I mean, when I'm writing about the band, yeah, I'm going to say we took this from Fela, we took this from Shlomo, we're doing Zorn's music, whatever, but it's primarily about the music for me and the musical elements. And that's also like, and I'm happy to talk more about it and take this conversation wherever, but like when we get together as musicians, maybe we could stand to talk about the context a little more, but it's more like, okay, what's the musical goal? What are we trying to accomplish here? What songs are we playing? You know, the horn players will like have a little huddle and decide like, cause I'm a guitar player. So like when I write the horn music, it's all messed up. So they have to go and like translate it into what actually works. So that's like a 2-hour rehearsal right there. We don't have time to be like, what's the meaning of it? You know what I mean?
Sure.
Often we don't, for better or for worse. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where it starts for me. And we talked about, like when you and I were talking about what we would discuss in this interview, like I've gotten pushback from people like, you can't play Afrobeat.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Yeah.
That was my next question of, you know, how have people responded?
Generally, overall, it's been really positive. The people that have heard it seem to have enjoyed it. And I've definitely like, we've had the privilege, which I really see so much now when we can't play, as what a privilege it is and has been to play throughout the US and in Europe. We went to Krakow, we've been to Italy, Germany, Austria. We played at the Ashkenaz Festival in Toronto and different places in the US. Overall, the response has been super positive, and depending on the audience, people might already be familiar with Afrobeat. Like we played at the Saalfelden Jazz Festival in Austria. So as like a sophisticated jazz audience, like Fela is going to be more of a reference that they'll understand than Karlbach. And then they'll be like, oh, that's so cool that you did this with Afrobeat. And then we'll play like at the Krakow Jewish Festival, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. But like some big, Jewish music fan will be like, it's so cool that you did that with Jewish music. Who is this Fela guy? And then the other guy's like, who is this rabbi? So it depends on where the people are coming from. But as I mentioned the other day, like I've gotten some hate mail for the band. And to be honest, it hasn't been anything threatening or like concerning. It's just like, you don't have a right to do this, your music sucks. Like I've heard that before. But at first I was like kind of upset by it. And then I realized like, I've never gotten hate mail from my music before. This is kind of amazing. Like that somebody would care about it enough to tell me that they didn't like it. Usually if people don't like it, they're just going to walk away. But what I say is like, look, I'm doing my best that I can to be genuine and to play music that I love. If somebody feels that a white Jewish person from New York can't play or isn't allowed to or has no claim of being able to play music that's influenced by this Nigerian, musical figure, like, okay, I'm not going to say that they can't believe that. Like, obviously I don't agree because I'm playing it, but if you don't like it, don't listen to it. Like, that's kind of like what I usually say. Certainly there's more to talk about that, but that's kind of how I approach it.
You kind of think about it, so just for those, who weren't sure where the title of our talk today came from, right?
Oh yeah.
The Africa 70, right, was sort of Fela's kind of probably most well-known formulation, right?
The first one. The second one was Egypt 80.
Right. Okay. Right.
Which is where I took.
And there's always right. Which there you go.
Right. Okay, that I stole. Okay,
but there you go. No,
I
but
changed it to something Jewish. I stole it.
It's beautiful because you made my point for me, right? Because Egypt 80, Zion 80. There's a message of liberation, right? And so much of what Fela's music is about liberation. It's about and muscular liberation and freedom of the self and pride and
Yep.
And I have to think maybe that was part of your thinking. I know you don't like one of the, but you must have been inspired from somewhere, because there's something to that. There's something about that like pride and authenticity and power that I don't know. That's one of the thought I had.
Yeah. No. Yes, for sure. Yes, and that came afterwards for me. The way I found out about Fela is like I was talking about my friend Eyal, and he didn't know who Fela was. My wife and I were visiting friends like years ago, I think even before our kids were born. So like 15, 20 years ago, we were visiting friends, and my friend just mentioned Fela in a conversation, and I was like, what? And he's like, seriously, you don't know who Fela was? Like, and this was I don't even remember when it was, but it was at a time when he was like, we're going to the record store tomorrow and you're going to get a Fela CD. And that's what we did. And it's called the best of Fela Kuti. It's a double CD set, a double album. And I heard it and I was like, this is incredible. It's like a travesty that I never heard this before. And the first thing I connected was the way that he uses the guitar in his music, which is a whole other thing. But as a guitar player, I'm like listening for that. It hit me in the gut like immediately. And then I found out, oh, who is this guy? Like, where's he from? Like, he has an accent. Like, where's he? And then, you look him up or whatever. So, honestly, the thing that struck me about him as I thought about it, him and Karlbach, was that they each embraced their particular culture and their history, but used it as a stepping stone to do something universal. And it, to me, like, they're emblematic of this model of universalism and particularism being kind of two sides of the same coin and not in opposition to each other. And that was like a common thing. And I don't think it's an accident that both of their musics came out of like the 60s, whether that was the 60s in Africa and post-colonialism and all that, which I don't know that much about that history, but I do know that that's a huge factor. And then, Shlomo Karlbach and Haight-Ashbury, like trying to get the hippies to come to shul, and it was a revolutionary time, and that definitely, like, the vitality of that definitely spoke to me for sure.
Well, I think, do you think that given what's going on now, the fact that we're really kind of finally, we're really having real conversations right now, in a way that from my life, born in the 70s, hasn't really been out there in a way. Do you feel like that gives us sort of urgency to what you're doing with Zion 80?
It's interesting. Maybe I hadn't thought about it like that, but yes, I started the band in 2011. Our first record came out, I think, in 2013. So it's a little before that, even before the 2016 election. And honestly, there's a project that I'm focused on a little more at the moment. Zion 80 is not gone, but I really did it very like intensely for, 6-7 years. So I'm working on another project that is more overtly like relating to what's going on culturally and politically now. But yeah, for sure. And also like it ties back to the revolutionary quality of of John Zorn's music and his radical Jewish culture thing, which has been going on since the 90s, of like claiming a Jewish identity, but in a way that's like very authentic for me, somebody that came up in punk rock, or for him, somebody that came up in like 20th century classical music and avant-garde jazz, but like, I'm Jewish and I'm going to deal with this and play Jewish music in my way. So there is that kind of identity aspect to it that is always at play for me, I think.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I want to kind of open it up. If there are any questions from our audience, I'm just going to open it up for a few minutes. I'm kind of hanging here with my comments open. So if you want to ask a question about anything we've discussed, or to dig a little deeper into what we've been talking about, please just go into your chat and open it up and take a look. And in the meantime, I'm gonna push a little bit more on the that's the one element that I didn't emphasize really is the radical Jewish culture movement, right? Do you see your other work as kind of connected to that? For instance, Rashanim, the other projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, I will say, because I opened the chat to see if there's comments, and John Greenfield gave a shout out to Bad Brains.
I missed it. Oh, I'm sorry.
So I just want to say that Bad Brains is amazing. And the I dub, I think it's called I dub record, is like on heavy rotation. And I love them. And they're a really cool, just a whole world into themselves, combining punk rock and reggae music and dub. That's a whole other thing. But yes, Bad Brains, 100%. Yes. In a word, when I moved to New York in 2000, to Brooklyn, and I was very intent on starting a radical Jewish culture band, because I was really influenced by Zorn's Masada project and all the records that he was putting out on his label, Tzaddik. And that really encompassed kind of the totality of the projects that I did through Zion 80. And since then, in my newer projects and with Chant Records, I've been a little like wanting to expand it a little more. So the projects that I'm working on now are not explicitly Jewish. I'm certainly not shying away from that, but I'm kind of deliberately going into a different area and not doing things that are explicitly defined as Jewish, or not limiting them to something defined as Jewish. Just kind of seeing like what's all this stuff that I've gathered in here that I really respond to. So this one new project I'm doing with this poet and MC is like kind of more coming from like rock with some jazz elements and hip hop. And then my other kind of thing that I'm working on now is an electronic experimental project that's not of any particular genre. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. I'm sorry.
No, for sure. So I want to throw it out again. So I'm looking here. Ronnie has actually put out a question, which I think is an interesting one. What, to the extent, how do you see music as kind of building bridges in community? I mean, like we talked about the kind of question of universality, and that is that something that you see? And particularly at this moment, do you see that as being something that you're doing?
That I'm doing? I hope so.
Or even generally.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the thing that it makes me think of, and we can certainly discuss this, is that I think that it's sometimes, while the cultural appropriation discussion is an important one to have, and if the thing is out there in the world, you should talk about it. It doesn't help that you're just pretending it doesn't exist. I think that sometimes can serve to divide people in ways that they could be coming together. And I'll just give you the examples from my own experience of like, I'll just say, because the first thing that came to mind, in 2018, Zion 80 went to Europe for 2 shows with John Zorn. We played at the Sarajevo Jazz Festival, and then we played at this great club in Vienna called Porgy and Bess, where I've played before. And I could kind of tell that somebody who worked at the club, who was like the manager, I have a complicated relationship with my kippah when I'm in Europe, which I'm sure other people can relate to, because you don't want to get beaten up, but I'll say like, no, this is who I am. Like, I'm in Vienna. Why can't I wear my kippah? But I usually go for the baseball cap, just saying. But when I play, I don't like to wear a baseball cap because I want to be myself. And also I'm already so sweaty. It's like not even funny. So I don't want to put another hat on. So like, I could tell that he was kind of, I don't know. I was interpreting his body language that he was a little uncomfortable around me. It's a feeling that I felt a lot in Europe. and I'm aware of it. And I'm like, I just try to be like a mensch. Like he wasn't saying anything. He wasn't like a race, anti-Semite. He wasn't being anti-Semitic. I only knew him on that night. He was a manager. He was like a little bit. And then he mentioned this album. I'm blanking on the name. Iron Path by Last Exit. It's phenomenal. It's Bill Laswell and Sonny Sharrock and Peter Brutzman and Ronald Shannon Jackson, the drummer. So it's one of my favorite records. As soon as he mentioned that, I was like, man, that's one of my favorite records. And we immediately connected, and his inhibition just went, it just disappeared. And he's like, oh, did you hear the drum sound on this song? And all of a sudden we were like 17-year-old music geeks. It didn't matter that I was Jewish. It didn't matter that he's Austrian. It's just like we connected on that. And I've had that experience so many times with I had that experience in Houston where I played a gig and I did a workshop at a high school. And it's for a music class. The music class was all kinds of kids. And I started talking about Fela. And I'm like, has anybody heard of Fela? This Nigerian kid raises his hand and is like, yeah, my uncle used to be the bass player in his band.
Wow.
And I was like, why am I talking to you? Let's switch places. He laughed. I mean, he's a kid, but like that immediately was like, I wasn't like a 40-something white Jewish and he wasn't an 18-year-old Nigerian high school student living in Nigeria. He was like, my uncle played with Fela. I was like, I got a lot of questions for you, like I want to know about that and the tours and whatever. So I think that that like writ large, it's not just those anecdotes, but that writ large is like the power, it's a cliche, but it's like the power of music to bring people together. And I think, I don't know. I think that anybody has a right to be into whatever they're into and to play whatever they want to play, in a word. And I do have more to say on that. And I actually looked up a couple of articles that I had seen, which we can talk about more, like specifically the Angelique Kidjo thing that came out. Yeah.
Mention that. Yeah.
Ronnie, you're on mute, but I could still hear you.
I was going to say, I remember hearing two amazing interviews with Angelique Kidjo, who is she's from Benin, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right? So it's a French-speaking country on the coast of Africa, Yoruba.
Mm-hmm.
My family's from Cuba, and so I love Afro-Cuban music, and that's Yoruba music, by the way. That's blended with Spanish music, which is really Andalusian and Arabic. Comes through in the instruments, and you see all these things come through. That's why she in these two interviews, I think possibly this whole cultural appropriation problem is a very American hang-up, because also we had Kwame Anthony Appiah, the ethicist from the New York Times. He spoke last fall. The Schneier Center hosted him, and one of his big things is critiquing this notion of cultural appropriation. He says it doesn't make any sense. Everything is everything. We're all interconnected. It's a globalized world. He talked about like the style of kente, what here we call it kente cloth. He had I forget the name, but like the type of cloth that was traditional in his homeland. But that silk came from China.
Yeah.
And the patterns were, evolved over time when they came in contact with Europeans, and so the thing which marks you as a royal person in Ghana, in his part of Ghana, is what do you mean authentic? What does that even mean? And so with Angelique Kidjo, she in her Talking Heads project, she said she's in Paris and she's a student in Paris, and she's hearing the Talking Heads for the first time at a party, and she's like, that's African music. And everyone laughed at her. And she's like, oh, you're just African, so that's what you think. You think everything's African. Or something like that. It's kind of like what they say to Jews, right? Oh,
yeah.
Right?
Everybody's Jewish.
And she's like, no, you're wrong. And later in life, she met David Byrne. He's like, of course it's African music. And she did this amazing thing. She says the same thing about Celia Cruz. She has a Celia Cruz tribute album where she's like, I saw Celia Cruz when I was a young. Celia Cruz, for those who don't know, she's also known as Azúcar. She's sugar. She is like the goddess of Cuban music.
Absolutely.
Certainly in the exile, as we like to say. And, she's, dark-skinned Cuban woman, super, super successful. she played at concerts in Africa, and for her, she said, for two things. Oh, this is what salsa sounds like. But we play salsa totally different because they were huge into salsa that they absorbed. So it went back and forth. You had this music coming from Africa, going to the Caribbean, coming back to Africa in a transformed way. And she said, when I saw Celia on the stage, I said, I could be a musician too, because women, that wasn't for women in her culture.
Yeah.
And so again, like, let's think, I wonder why, and I'll pose it as a question instead of a statement. Why is it such an issue in America? We have here people who know about other cultures. Rachel, maybe you can fill in, like Paris and France. Is it a similar tension there? I mean, I think it's a very modern American problem, because we know, through culture at least, that it's always been an amalgamation. I mean,
absolutely.
Elvis is playing black music, you know what I mean? And then it turns it into something else. I mean,
I think you have to argue, right, that there is a problem of dispossession in America that's unique, given our history, a modern history of slavery, right? The fact that what we call appropriation is really kind of dispossession, right? The idea that in making a piece of music which you are lifting wholesale from a culture that is really, actively oppressed, that has a moral component to it that might not be the case in other contexts. That would be my guess. What do you think, Jon?
Well, it's funny because I wrote this quote down from Angelique Kidjo, which I'll read. I'll read it and then we talk about it. So Ronnie alluded to this. So Angelique Kidjo last year, I think, and maybe it was the interview on NPR that you heard. I think it was on, I can hear the guy's voice. I think it's out like on Sunday afternoons. I was driving somewhere and I heard her talking, and I figured out after a minute who she was, because I know her singing voice, not her speaking voice. And I've listened to a lot of her music. And then I was like, oh my gosh, she covered song to song Talking Heads' Remain in Light. So for Talking Heads fans, for Angelique Kidjo, I mean, it's tremendous to have that entire album as a cover album. Tony Allen played on that, by the way, from Fela's band. Okay, so this is what she said. This is an interview in Pitchfork. I'll just quote it because I wrote it down. From the moment you give credit to the people who inspire you and you don't copy their songs, it's not cultural appropriation, it's cultural expression. In the interview that I heard, she called it expansion, which I actually like that word better. With Elvis Presley, that's not the case. He stole the songs. When you blatantly take a song and put your name on it, it's not cultural appropriation, it's stealing. And then obviously the implication is it's wrong. If you recognize where it comes from, no problem. It's not cultural appropriation to me when you acknowledge it. So I wonder, I mean, I'm just putting it out there, you guys are the academics and the historians, but like, I wonder if the dispossession thing is like, maybe in a different context earlier in our history, and I'm not saying these things don't exist at all, but I think there was a point earlier in the history when like, maybe like acknowledging your influences almost like wasn't possible. Or there was some way that the people who had actually created it were so cut off from being able to benefit from it at all that like it did have this taint to it of like a white person going and playing the blues. I don't think that's the reality now, but that's my opinion, and I'm happy to be pushed back against about that. But I hear what you're saying. But it is an important distinction. Like, when Elvis was playing an old blues, like what he's doing is 100 times worse than the worst cultural appropriation, because he's actually stealing something that doesn't belong to him. And this is a whole other conversation. Maybe it's more a musical artistic conversation. But based on what Ronnie said, I love the phenomenon of one person trying to imitate the music of another person, and they do it wrong. As hard as they try to do it wrong, and they come up with something new. Like Led Zeppelin has a song called Dire Maker. I can't remember what album it's on. It's a play on it's a I don't know. It's
the Holy, I think.
Yeah. So like it's them trying to play reggae music. As reggae music, it's a complete failure. But it's so cool that they did that. The Clash got it much better playing reggae music. But but still, they'd be the first ones to acknowledge. And like the Clash and Bob Marley are, for a hardcore music fan, are worlds apart. But you can hear like, or the Police, like, oh, I hear how they took, roots reggae and brought it together with punk. And like, that's my favorite stuff about music.
I just want to put a question out here. So I've got a couple of comments that I'm going to read out because I think they're really spot on from Mariah. She says, well, we can acknowledge cultural appreciation, claiming something as our own that isn't. Jon isn't doing this, right? He's honest about his Jewishness and his outsiderness, right? So, and I think that's a pretty good way to put it, right? And Mariah also pointed out there's a kind of posturing, which Presley, I think, clearly,
Yes.
it's that, right? A posturing of claiming an authenticity that you don't have a right to claim. And I will add one thing, right? Just
that's a very good point, by the way.
Absolutely. But from a historical note, I think it's important to note also that the situation of mid-century America was such that Black artists had to be erased for commercial reasons, right? There was that. The structural racism was such that, and so it's dispossession. It's in the context of erasure, right? Which I think is another important sort of like element to that, right?
Or like relegated to what they called race records, right?
Right.
Or like playing in their own baseball league.
Well, it's really the legacy of segregation in many ways, right?
Totally.
I mean, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right. So like in a way, the problem is not that a white person's playing the music as much as this Black person can't go on tour and do what a normal musician would do, or what a musician would expect to be able to do. You can't earn a living from it. Right. You're just like pushed down into this place. That's the problem.
That's
in
right.
a way. Yeah.
Well, I have a comment from
economic. Yes.
I have a comment from Jeffrey
100%.
Friedman who points out that and I think it's a very interesting point, right? Appropriation as a metaphor for reading or interpretation doesn't actually have pejorative connotations in French. I guess Rachel could also affirm that. I'm looking at Rachel Mesh's image here, wondering if she's has any comment to that. No? Okay.
Sorry.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I'm out of my depth with the music history here, but I would say that I think that I don't know about French popular music borrowing from music from people of African descent in France. I mean, French popular music is not known for its high quality in the same way. So it's not the same sort of financial situation.
I love there like crazy, right?
What?
We love jazz, and France was a place that a lot of American artists and musicians, African American artists and musicians who were very frustrated back in the States, found a welcomed home. But I know that was racially charged as well, and its own exoticism and its own, but I'll just
I mean, it's just, I wouldn't say it's very culturally specific in the same way that the questions about racism that are happening right now here in America and in France, they're being expressed in full force in France, and they just have their own very specific history, and it's just as bad there as it is here. Their role in slavery is not absent, right? It's just different. But the colonial history, it's culturally specific. So I'm not up to speed on sort of the debates around cultural appropriation. I doubt that that's a concept that has taken hold in thinking about France. They tend to be in a sort of on a different trajectory in terms of the way that these questions are posed and framed by their own academy.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot.
No, it's okay.
Actually, Jeff?
I just want,
Yeah, so I mean, it's a term that's used a lot in the academic study of the history of reading. So Roger Chartier is a big figure in this, and it doesn't have pejorative connotations. So l'appropriation d'un texte implies a kind of creative reinventing, and which isn't to say that there might not be other words that perform a similar, that do a similar kind of intellectual work to the word appropriation in English. But appropriation in French, so far as I'm aware, doesn't have pejorative connotations. Anyway.
We're running a little bit down to the wire here, but I do have one question that John Greenfield put up that I really
I was going to say that also. I didn't know.
It's a cool question.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, if we could take another minute, are you okay, John, for another minute or one last question? Okay.
Yeah. What time is it?
So
yes, absolutely. I'm good.
1:59. So he asks, I'm curious how you see the present moment impacting culture and music in New York City. Zorn came out of the 80s downtown scene where movements like punk, no wave, and hip hop mixed with a vibrant art scene with Basquiat, Schnabel et al. Do you anticipate a similar cultural flowering post-COVID?
I don't know. I mean, well, I think things were very different from things were already very different from the 80s before COVID in terms of real estate prices and people moving away. And I mean, I've had lots of conversations with Zorn about this. I mean, not the smallest thing in our little world was like that his club Stone closed and kind of got absorbed into the new school before all this. It's not happening now, but I don't know. That stuff was like, I feel like in the long term, I mean, certainly I hope we can get back to some live music at some point, whether it's in New York or everywhere, but I feel like things like streaming and the real estate prices and all those things were, in the long term, will have a larger impact just on the way that music is. I don't know. It's so hard to tell. It's a very good question, though. And I also love Ronnie's comment that the baseball cap only helps people know that you're wearing it. I mean, touche.
Well, listen, I would, and in the past have explored these issues much more deeply. I would have loved for us to be able to spend 2 more hours, but we all got to get back to our day jobs, unfortunately. So I just want to thank you, Jon, so much for coming in and taking the time. And I mean, I found this to be a really delightful conversation.
Likewise, thank you. It's my pleasure.
And I really thank you to all of our friends here who've shown up to kind of listen to this, and for the future listeners on the recorded version of this, thank you too. So I'm gonna close things down here. So thanks again, Jon, for this conversation, and to all of you for joining us today. YU Voices is sponsored by the YU Center for Israel Studies and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs and Madai HaYahadut Judaic Studies at YU. We'll see you in 2 weeks on July 9th for our next program. And that program will be featuring the Yeshiva University Curator of Special Collections and Hebraica Judaica, Shulamit Berger, who will be speaking on documenting orthodoxy and COVID for future generations in her archival work. So thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.